Excerpts from Part 4, Chapter 18 of Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. Dead body breathing. Something flew through the window in the door of Louis's cell and struck the floor, breaking into white bits. It was 2 pieces of hard tack, the dry biscuit that was the standard fare of sailors. A tiny cup of tea, so weak that it was little more than hot water, so small that it constituted a single swallow, was set on the sill. Phil received food also, but no water. He and Louis crawled about their cells, picking up slivers of biscuit and putting them into their mouths. A guard stood outside. There was a rustle outside Louis's cell, and a face appeared. The man greeted Louis cheerfully in English, by name. Louis stared up at him. The man was a Kwajalein native, and he explained that the American castaways were the talk of the island. A sports fanatic, he had recognized Louis's name, which Louis had given to his captors. Prattling about track, football, and the Olympics, he paused only rarely to ask Louis questions. Once Louis got 1 or 2 words off, the native bounded back into his narrative. After a few minutes, the native glanced at his watch and said he had to leave. Louis asked him what had happened to the Marines whose names were carved into the wall. In the same chipper tone, the native replied that the Marines were dead. All of the POWs held on that island, he said, were executed. As the native walked out, the guard looked challengingly at Louis, lifted a flattened hand to his throat, and made a slashing gesture. He pointed to the names on the wall, then to Louis. The morning of the 2nd day began. Phil and Louis lay in sweltering silence, thinking that at any moment they'd be dragged out and beheaded. The guards stalked back and forth, snarling at the captives and drawing the sides of their hands across their necks with sadistic smiles. For Louis, the digestive miseries continued. His diarrhea became explosive, and cramps doubled him over. He lay under a blanket of flies and mosquitoes, keeping his buttocks over the waist hole for as long as he could, until the guard snapped at him to move his face back to the hole. The day passed. 3 times, a single wad of rice, a little bigger than a golf ball, sailed through the door window and broke against the floor. Once or twice, a swallow of tea in a cup was left on the sill, and Louis sucked it down. Night came. Another day came and went, then another. The heat was smothering. Lice hopped over the captives' skin. Mosquitoes preyed on them in swarms so thick that when Louis snapped his fingers into a fist, then opened his hand, his entire palm was crimson. His diarrhea worsened, becoming bloody. Each day Louis cried out for a doctor. One day a doctor came. He leaned into the cell, looked at Louis, chuckled, and walked away. Curled up on the gravelly floor, both men felt as if their bones were wearing through their skin. Louis begged for a blanket to sit on, but was ignored. He passed the time trying to strengthen his legs, pulling himself upright and standing for a minute or 2 while holding the wall, then sinking down. He missed the raft. 2 sips of water a day weren't nearly enough to replace Louis's torrential fluid loss. His thirst became worse than anything he'd known on the raft. He crawled to the door and pleaded for water. The guard left, then returned with a cup. Louis, grateful, drew close to the door to take a drink. The guard threw scalding water in his face. Louis was so dehydrated that he couldn't help but keep begging. At least 4 more times the response was the same, leaving Louis's face speckled with blisters. Louis knew that dehydration might kill him, and part of him hoped it would. Louis often stared at the names of the Marines, wondering who they were, if they'd had wives and children, how the end had come for them. He began to think of them as his friends. One day he pulled off his belt and bent the buckle upward. In tall, block letters, he carved his name into the wall beside theirs. Louis couldn't speak to Phil, nor Phil to him, but occasionally one of them would cough or scuff the floor to let the other know that he was there. Once the guards left the cells unattended, and for the first time Phil and Louis were alone. Louis heard Phil's voice. "What's going to happen?" Louis had no answer. There was a beating of boots in the hall, and the Americans fell silent. The guards maintained a fixed state of fury at the captives, glaring at them wrathfully, making threatening gestures, shouting at them. Virtually every day they flew into rages that usually ended in Phil and Louis being bombarded with stones and lit cigarettes, spat upon, and poked with sticks. Louis always knew that he was in for it when he heard a guard arriving in a stomping fit, a consequence, he hoped, of an American victory. The situation worsened when the guard had company. The guards used the captives to impress each other with their cruelty. The pretext for many of the outbursts was miscommunication. The captives and their guards came from cultures with virtually no overlap in language or custom. Louis and Phil found it almost impossible to understand what was being asked of them. Sign language was of little help, because even the culture's gestures were different. The guards, like nearly all citizens of their historically isolated nation, had probably never seen a foreigner before, and probably had no experience in communicating with a non-Japanese. When misunderstood, they often became so exasperated that they screamed at and beat the captives. For self-preservation, Louis and Phil studied everything they heard, developing small Japanese vocabularies. Kotikoi meant "come here." Ohio was a greeting used by the occasional civil guard. Though Louis soon knew what it meant, his stock reply was, "No, California." Phil learned that mitsu meant water, but the knowledge got him nowhere. His cries for mitsu were ignored. When the guards weren't venting their fury at the captives, they entertained themselves by humiliating them. Every day, at gunpoint, Louis was forced to stand up and dance, staggering through the Charleston while his guards roared with laughter. The guards made Louis whistle and sing, pelted him with fistfuls of gravel, taunted him as he crawled around his cell to pick up bits of rice, and slid long sticks through the door window so they could stab and swat him, finding his helpless contortions hilarious. Down the hall, the guards did the same to Phil. Sometimes Louis could hear Phil's voice, tiny and thin, groaning. Once, driven to his breaking point by a guard jabbing him, Louis yanked the stick from the guard's hands. He knew he might get killed for it, but under this unceasing degradation, something was happening to him. His will to live, resilient through all of the trials on the raft, was beginning to fray. The crash of the Green Hornet had left Louis and Phil in the most desperate physical extremity, without food, water, or shelter. But on Kwajalein, the guards sought to deprive them of something that had sustained them even as all else had been lost: dignity. This self-respect and sense of self-worth, the innermost armament of the soul, lies at the heart of humanness. To be deprived of it is to be dehumanized, to be cleaved from and cast below mankind. Men subjected to dehumanizing treatment experience profound wretchedness and loneliness, and find that hope is almost impossible to retain. Without dignity, identity is erased. In its absence, men are defined not by themselves, but by their captors and the circumstances in which they are forced to live. One American airman, shot down and relentlessly debased by his Japanese captors, described the state of mind that his captivity created. I was literally becoming a lesser human being. Few societies treasured dignity and feared humiliation as did the Japanese, for whom a loss of honor could merit suicide. This is likely one of the reasons why Japanese soldiers in World War II debased their prisoners with such zeal, seeking to take from them that which was most painful and destructive to lose. On Kwajalein, Louis and Phil learned a dark truth known to the doomed in Hitler's death camps, the slaves of the American South, and 100 other generations of betrayed people. Dignity is as essential to human life as water, food, and oxygen. The stubborn retention of it, even in the face of extreme physical hardship, can hold a man's soul in his body long past the point at which the body should have surrendered it. The loss of it can carry a man off as surely as thirst, hunger, exposure, and asphyxiation, and with greater cruelty. In places like Kwajalein, degradation could be as lethal as a bullet.